Hello and welcome everybody to the eToro quarterly popular investor call. Today I'm joined by a really awesome panel of guests, and today we're going to have a crypto specific popular investor call where we're going to talk about all things crypto. It's a lot going on at the moment in crypto, so it is very exciting. Just before I start the call, I just want to say that we are not employees of eToro, and anything we say is not financial advice. So now the disclaimers are out the way, I'm going to introduce you to this awesome panel of guests. So I'm going to start off with Claude. Claude, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey everyone, my name is Claude, aka Ralik on eToro. I'm originally from South Africa, now living in Bulgaria in Europe. I've been a popular investor since 2018 and on the platform since 2017. My portfolio focus is mainly crypto and tech stocks, and I take a long-term buy and hold approach, using mainly fundamental analysis for my decision-making around there, taking advantage of a few short-term plays if they present themselves.
Thank you very much, Claude. Over to you, Nick. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning, gents. Thanks for having me on, Stephen. My name's Nick Burt. I actually live in Rugby in the UK. I'm managing director for a biometric access control company. Been on eToro since May 2017 and a popular investor for around 3 years. My investment approach is obviously long-term, more macro-based, and probably around a 50-50 split between crypto, stocks and ETFs.
Great. Thanks very much, Nick. Over to you, Mark. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having us on, and delighted to be on the call again with Nick and Claude. My name is Mark O'Donnell, aka Marco D89 on eToro. I have been on eToro since 2016, popular investor since 2021. As you can imagine, I am mainly in crypto. It's about 60% of my portfolio at the moment. The rest is built with cash and tech stocks. My day job is revenue marketing for HubSpot. I'm really interested and excited about the future of technology and crypto. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And just for the sake of this video, I'll introduce myself as well. My name is Stephen. On the eToro platform, my is 84. I'm a macro investor, and I'm a full-time investor since 2020, but I've been investing for over 15 years. I do a lot of different fundamental analysis as well as technical analysis and on-chain metrics, and I invest in both traditional stocks as well as quite a strong focus as well on crypto. So that's the introductions out of the way. Now we're going to go into the meat and potatoes of the subject and talk more about crypto. It's been a very exciting last few months. Obviously, in 2023, it was a really great year for crypto. We saw lots of gains, especially in Bitcoin, as we started to see a lot of hype and furore around the Bitcoin ETF. And we did bounce up pretty nicely off those lows in 2022. And it was a really good year for Bitcoin and also other altcoins. So I just wanted to start off and get everybody's opinions on crypto at the moment and any areas that you're particularly bullish on for crypto in 2024. And if you could please state your reasons and some of the things that make you bullish about crypto. I'll start off with you, Claude.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, 2023 was quite a crazy year. I personally didn't expect such a recovery that we did see. Obviously, we were still not back at the previous all-time highs, but still significant recovery that did happen in the markets. Like you said, Bitcoin had by far the best recovery period with its dominance surging compared to the altcoins. And with the Bitcoin ETF approval, obviously we saw quite a lot of interest spark there. What I found quite interesting is I think we all anticipated the approval of the spot ETF. However, when it did get approved, we saw a various amount of swings in the market, mainly towards the downside. So it's quite interesting how the sell-off, what primarily appears to be from the GBTC play, how it is driving prices a little bit low at the moment. But in terms of 2024, the main narratives around crypto, I think for me, the main things I'm looking at is obviously a continued decline in the Bitcoin dominance, especially with regards to Ethereum. So I'm relatively excited about Ethereum's price action over the coming year. And then some other sort of more nuanced plays that I'm looking into are your DePIN areas. So for anyone who doesn't know, it's decentralized physical infrastructure networks. And I think it provides quite a lot of opportunity for these to be built out by the public, where as previously you would need quite a large capital inflow in order for these infrastructures to be built out. So things I'm looking at in those specific sectors, it's probably mostly interconnectivity when it comes to like your networks like 5G and internet, as well as cloud storage through decentralized cloud services. Those are my main things I'm looking at in the crypto market in 2024. I do, however, think that the DePINs are going to take a little bit of time to develop, as infrastructure doesn't just spring up in the space of 12 months. So that's my, say, 2 to 5 year plan, and continuing to monitor those industries there.
Okay, thanks very much, Claude. And in terms of the Bitcoin dominance, we're at quite historic high Bitcoin dominance at the moment. The majority of that is because of the hype around the ETF. Do you expect that to continue for a period of time? So you've mentioned that you expect the dominance to come down over time, but just in this kind of medium to short term period, do you expect the dominance to increase further before it drops off because of the inflows of Bitcoin into the Bitcoin ETF and the buying pressure?
So it's a tricky situation, because obviously trying to time the market in any industry is not exactly an easy thing to do. But in terms of my personal analysis, I do see the dominance coming down in the short to medium term. I do think this sort of initial drop that we are experiencing is a temporary event, and I would expect going to surge up back to the levels that it was previously at, around the 40 to 50K levels, once everything begins to calm down with the grayscale rebalancing that's happening and the massive inflow and outflows taking place as a result of the spot ETFs. And then after that, sort of in terms of an immediate short term, I would anticipate that the dominance decreases. Personally, I've recently made changes to my portfolio to account for this through decreasing Bitcoin exposure and increasing Ethereum exposure over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Claude, as well. And I think what tends to happen as well in the cycle is, as the cycle progresses, people get more kind of risk on as the price goes up. So it starts off with Bitcoin, goes into Ethereum, the other layer ones, and then it works its way all the way out to the dog coins before it all goes to shit. That's usually the way it works. Anyway, thanks very much, Claude. And over to you, Nick. Is there any kind of key drivers for crypto in 2024 that you're excited about and shows you the bullish case for crypto, Bitcoin?
Yeah, it actually feels as though we've finally come from the Wild West and arrived at Wall Street. And I actually bought the dip last night. I think there was a 5% sort of dip last night. So I actually took that opportunity to add to my allocation in Bitcoin. Yeah, so looking at, I think, the catalysts for this year, apart from obviously the approval of the ETFs, which for me gives validity to the asset class, it's institutional approval. And I think it'll take time until we see those real significant inflows. Of course, there was the initial furore around the approval, but as time goes on with the education and the marketing that we've seen, adoption will grow and there will be allocation in portfolios to Bitcoin. So I think it'll take time to play out. I think the catalyst that we'll see, of course, the halving is around the corner, around April, so we'll have that supply shock. But looking outside of the obvious catalysts, I think one that's being overlooked is the FASB fair value accounting. So that will allow corporates to hold Bitcoin on their balance sheets as well. I think that's underestimated. And also from a macro point of view, presidential years, they tend to be very positive for the stock markets. And I think that could only help crypto as well this year. Once we start to see real price appreciation and we get up towards the all-time highs, we'll see retail FOMO really start piling in. I think they are the sort of catalyst that we can expect. More speculative catalysts that I've been thinking about is probably left field. We may well get another country adding Bitcoin to its sovereign treasury as well. We may well get an announcement from a huge corporate such as Apple, maybe buying Bitcoin. But also, I think we'll see other exchanges around the world approving ETFs as well, not just in the US. I think that could happen as well. So I think there's a bunch of nailed on catalysts, and then there's some speculative catalysts that could well happen as well this year.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. I agree with you about the FASB accounting rules as well. I think that's really underestimated. I think the reason why it's underestimated and not priced into the market yet is it doesn't come live until towards the end of 2024. But that's going to be a massive thing. And I think a lot of the corporate companies at the moment will be spending this kind of 6 to 9 months really studying how they can put this on their balance sheet and how it can be an advantage to them as a company. But yeah, I also see that as a massive catalyst. What's your thinking in terms of sovereign countries putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet? Argentina? Anyone for Argentina?
Milei in Davos is certainly shaking them up over there, isn't he? It was a very impressive speech that he delivered to the forum, the Economic Forum, a couple of days ago. It could happen. It could be another African country. Who knows? But it certainly wouldn't surprise me if we saw another country adopting Bitcoin this year.
Yeah, it all just continues to add credibility, even if it's a small country on top of El Salvador. It shows that the kind of model's working. Great. Thanks very much, Nick. Over to you, Mark. Any of your key factors that are bullish for Bitcoin in 2000?
Yeah, Claude and Nick have touched on a few of them already. I did want to just bring one other part into the ETF discussion. So one of the things that has been one of the largest changes I've seen is around the narrative on Bitcoin. So if you look at, say, for instance, BlackRock, which is the largest holder in terms of assets under management now from the ETF perspective, their marketing and messaging is quite mundane, which is probably what it needs. You're going after people who are probably taking Bitcoin serious as an investment for the first time. They're likely older people. They're likely people who are used to like B2B marketing, say, for instance, which is quite dry. So how they're speaking to their potential clients is a big step, to be honest, in terms of moving away from the traditional narrative around Bitcoin being secretive, being going against the grain. I think this is a massive change. I think what it does open is for traditional investors to really start to understand why Bitcoin is a valid investment as part of their portfolio. But I also think it opens up their inquisition to diversify outside of just Bitcoin. So I think like when we look at what could potentially come down the line, there's an Ethereum ETF being talked about. I do think that'll take a little bit more time. However, what's attractive about an Ethereum ETF is you've got your staking benefits. So it's like a dividend yield that they might get. There's more narratives around the underlying value of Ethereum, which might already be able to demonstrate that value to people who are not only Bitcoin naysayers, but don't really understand how to value Bitcoin versus a traditional stock or company. So I think there's some really good pieces in play at the moment. I think the news of the ETF potential approval is really what made the market move. There was always that chance that it was going to be a sell the news event. It's sold the news. I do think there's potential for more of a correction at the moment. However, it does look positive from inflows to the new was just checking there this morning. There's $3 billion worth of assets under management there currently. I know the Grayscale fund is still got, I don't know how many Bitcoin, but I think it's 95% of the Bitcoin is still in Grayscale. So I think when that all balances out, we'll get an understanding then of what the new inflows look like. And I think that's really going to help that institutional buy-in.
I think an important point is the ETFs will provide a route to market for a lot of people that still are very nervous about self-custody. I think self-custody still for Bitcoin is a real challenge for people if you're not in the space. And so exposure with the ETFs is a channel where people can get exposure to Bitcoin very easily. So I think it's extremely positive from that point of view.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think for a very low fees for what, 0.2, 0.3% fee,
Yeah.
I think that's a price that a lot of people are willing to pay in order not to self-custody. I think we've always got to remember there's many different people in this type of market, right? You've got the kind of real early adopters, usually people that are a bit younger, etc., who want to self-custody and they want to really launch into all things crypto and learn the ins and outs of the technology. And I think there are people that are a little bit older from a traditional finance background that want exposure to the asset because it helps their investment portfolio, but they don't necessarily want to hold their own private keys. I think that's very positive. There's going to be a huge amount of advertising around this Bitcoin spot ETF. I think we can tell from the fee wars that are already happening at the moment. And I wouldn't be surprised if over the next month or two, there's super BOATs and all sorts of stuff to really bring the Bitcoin spot ETF to the attention of the public. So I think although the inflows are really good at the moment, they're naturally going to get more, the more brokers that have the ETF on them and the more rolled out they are to clients. And you've got to also remember at each one of these ETF, there's like a real sales team of people going around to clients promoting Bitcoin to put into their portfolio. So I think those inflows are going to go up with time. And I do think that the GBTC selling will start to slow down possibly over the next couple of weeks. I think we've got to remember as well that some of that selling of people selling at the moment in GBTC, they have to actually sell the Bitcoin, obviously, because the fees are very high on GBTC, but they could very well go into another ETF maybe next week or a couple of weeks later. They might just be reallocating their portfolio to a lower cost ETF.
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the reasons why I liquidated a large portion of my GBT position. Obviously, we had the 40% discount in the price itself. So it just seemed like an obvious play to load up on GBTC. And now that discount's narrowed, I think it's down to about what the fee is, which is around 1.5% the last time I checked. You have a lot of people taking those profits from that play, selling off their GBTC position for that purpose, as well as, like you mentioned, Stephen, the ridiculously high fees that they have associated with it compared to the competitors. Someone needs to call up Grayscale and remind them that there is actually a fee war taking place because they don't seem to be aware of it.
Actually, I think they're very aware of it. I had exactly the same point of view, first of all, when I saw the fees. But then if I think about it more deeply, I think that obviously GBTC, they already have the most amount of Bitcoin under management. Yeah. A lot of those people aren't going to want to sell their GBTC because they don't want to take profits and cause a taxable event. So I think there'll be a lot of people that stay in it because they don't want to cause a taxable event. And even if they lost, say, 30% of their AUM, then they're actually still going to make a lot more money at 1.5% fee than they would if they reduced it all down to 0.2, 0.3%. But they're probably very unlikely to get new inflows. That would be the main issue. Okay. And also, what does everybody think about Bitcoin in terms of the upcoming cycle? Obviously, if we look at the traditional markets, it's anticipated that there could be some interest rate cuts in 2000. There could be more liquidity in the market. We're seeing dropping inflation. So there is a potential scenario where we could actually go below the Fed's target of 2%. So we all know what that means. Printer goes brrr. Do we expect that to be a bullish catalyst? Because one of the things that I've really noticed, if you look at a side-by-side chart of the Bitcoin price compared with global liquidity, so we look at global M2, for example, monetary supply, there is often a very large correlation between money supply and the Bitcoin price, obviously, as it's a finite asset. Do we see that as being a bullish catalyst for 2024? What do you think, Claude?
Personally, like coming down to the halving and everything, you also need to ask yourself, at what point is it all priced in? We do go through these cycles about every 4 years and see relatively the same thing every cycle. So at some point, it's going to do the opposite of what everybody expects. So the question there then becomes, is it going to be this cycle or the next or a few in the future? I personally think we're probably going to see the same thing, the cycle that we have every previous one, just because of the whole interest rate situation in the States at the moment. So we are obviously expecting interest rate cuts this year. And with inflation coming down, I've personally been under the belief that the Fed's been way overshooting in terms of the interest rate hikes, because inflation does take a long time to react to anything that the Fed does. Like you said, if the money printer goes better, then we're definitely going to be in a situation where all risk on assets fluctuate quite significantly. And not to take things away from crypto right now, but we're already seeing what US tech's doing through NASDAQ. That's just reached another new all-time high. And if interest rates continue to fall and inflation looks like it's under control, then I see no reason as to why we won't have a really bullish halving once again.
I just add as well, I think overall I am bullish with the rate of which the interest rates are going to come down. However, I think that's also priced in to a certain extent from maybe a month or two back. What we've got obviously in between there is what's going on in the Red Sea at the moment and how that's going to impact the cost of goods and the cost of having to send a ship around the Horn of Africa rather than through the Red Sea. So like already we've seen the cost of a shipping crate is gone 3x up. That's going to be passed on to the customer ultimately. And then what rate does that get passed on and how does that get reflected in the CPI figure, say, for instance, in another quarter? I think we don't know the exact depth of what that's going to impact on global markets just yet. But I think that's a major concern on how the Fed particularly deal with reducing interest rates. So I think that's a little factor that's potentially going to slow down the inflation decline. But again, I think we're too early to tell. But we just have to also be aware of the continuing conflicts in Ukraine and Israel and Gaza, and how that impacts then the markets as well. But I think all considering, we're still in a bullish view, but with some concerns that we really need to take seriously in how we assess the markets.
I think they're all valid points, but my opinion on this is that Bitcoin doesn't care. It is going to do its thing. It's going to go through its cycle as it always has done. And I think this may be the most explosive cycle that we'll probably see, and maybe the last, as the volatility dampens with the institutional adoption. I think we've had the run up of 150% last year. All the stars seem to be aligned with the major catalysts that are coming down the line this year. So I think this could be probably the most explosive cycle. But I think we'll see the same money flow cycles from Bitcoin, Ethereum, and then into the alts. And I just think, though, in time now moving forward, the extremes of the price actions will reduce. But I think it's going to do its thing like it always has done.
Yeah, that's a really interesting viewpoint as well, Nick, because one of the things that, Bitcoin and crypto is tended to do, as it's obviously still quite a young asset class, over time, as the years have progressed, each cycle, the volatility has reduced. For people that are not familiar with crypto, they'll say the volatility's reduced. It's still a hell of volatile, right? But it is actually reducing every single cycle. So I guess what we tend to see in past cycles, during the bull periods, we've seen diminishing returns in terms of percentage gains from the bottom to the top of the cycle. But then during bear markets, we've seen decreasing drawdowns, albeit still very brutal. So Do you expect that kind of pattern to potentially be different for this cycle in terms of diminishing returns because of the institutional involvement and the amount of money that's going to be flooding into Bitcoin and then later into Ethereum and other altcoins?
The last all-time high was what, $69,000. Reluctant to obviously put a price prediction, but I think we'll see a six-figure Bitcoin in this cycle. And I think this will potentially be one of the most explosive because of all the catalysts that we've discussed earlier. And I think then the drawdown will be less and the cycles will begin to tighten as we move forward. I think we're probably at a real inflection point, really, of moving from crypto-focused investors to Wall Street and mainstream.
I think another thing as well, I think with this particular cycle, that's where people are looking to your new innovative, like layer 2 coins and tokens and modular blockchains. They're looking for the next layer of innovation where there could be those 10, 20, 30x projects, because realistically in this cycle, we will see again the diminishing returns from Bitcoin in particular, even Ethereum. I think Ethereum still has a lot of upside still to go through this cycle, but I do think it won't be as explosive as previous cycles. So there will be that appetite to find those new projects and technologies where I suppose more seasoned crypto investors are looking at now.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be explosive, but it's going to seem more explosive than it is in terms of returns, because the numbers are obviously a lot bigger now. Obviously, if it surpasses 100,000, it seems like a huge rise, right? But that's obviously only, what, 2x from where we are now. But yeah, I think the numbers are going to seem pretty big. Claude, are you concerned at all about the institutionalization of the asset? How do you think it's going to change in this cycle? What do you think the effects are of these hedge funds, pension funds, ETF providers coming into the market will be, and how will it change from previous cycles?
So it's an interesting thing when it comes to the institutions, because that's been something that pretty much the entire crypto community has been wanting for a long time. Because as we mentioned already, it does add backing to the asset class as it is. It also props up the total market cap, which should be seen as a good thing, in my opinion, mostly due to the stability that it will create in the long term. Yes, we might have quite a lot of volatility in the short term, as we've seen with the ETFs, but overall, it's not like institutions are just going to immediately start dumping on retail, and it's like they end up propping up the asset class as a whole. In terms of that side of the institutional inflows, I'm personally looking forward to it. On the other side, where it could be seen as a little bit more bearish, with institutions comes regulation, and often quite a lot of regulation. And as I'm sure we all know, there are quite a few politicians and regulators that are not the biggest fans of crypto. If you take a look at Gensler, the only reason he pushed for the approval is because he felt like his hand was forced in the matter through the courts. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see similar pushback when it comes to the Ethereum ETFs. The SEC are most likely going to delay it right until the last minute and then probably go through the exact same process that we saw with the Bitcoin spot ETFs, where once again, it has to get taken to court and judges have to get involved and so forth. But then looking at some of the other players on the institutional side, that being the banks, they're not exactly the biggest fans of the crypto space. Recently, we had Vanguard essentially blocking all retail investors from making any type of crypto plays, which sparked the boycott Vanguard hashtag on Twitter, which was quite nice to see. So I think this is where retail really need to fight back against the banks and let their money talk. So if everyone's canceling their accounts and moving them to pro-crypto institutions, then it really will force the banks' hands there, because obviously you've got very strong relationships between a lot of the politicians, regulators, and the banking institutions. It's about creating balance there and trying to ensure that there's not too much influence coming from one way or another. But I see probably the biggest threat with regards to institutional inflow coming from the regulators as a result of that inflow.
Claude, you touch on a really important point there around the type of investor. You've got the boomers, obviously, who are, we're talking about the biggest transfer of wealth in history. As we move towards Gen X and millennials, digitally native investors, they are going to be pressurizing banks. And I think that's a really valid point. That is certainly going to help drive adoption as well, with the different newer generations who are used to transacting in digitally. They don't want cash. That's going to be a big driver, in my opinion.
One of the other that I wanted to add is, like, when we consider the traditional investor who has their portfolios on in these asset management companies, one of the things that they're going to obviously get exposure to as part of Bitcoin is an asset class that, I mean, is like no others that they have or they've had to date. So like, you look at like your bond yields, you look at your stock yields, on average, you're looking at like 4% or 9% on average a year. When Bitcoin gets added to that, obviously that's going to have that additional impact to their portfolio. But what it will be interesting to see, if the cycle plays out as it always has been, even albeit diminishing returns, what happens when the market sentiment sours a little bit, and what happens with, do people start to liquidate their ETF positions, and then what does that narrative look like in the market? So there's these kind of little things to think about in the future. People who've invested in Bitcoin can generally predict close enough to when the cycle is going to end and when it's going to decline. So it'll be interesting to understand what happens, particularly around the institutional narrative when an event like that happens.
Great point, Mark, because I was also thinking about this as well in a lot of detail, because right now we're all looking at the inflows of the ETF and all of the investors buying Bitcoin. Obviously, it's right at the start of after the ETF approval, and we're all really excited about the inflows. But I'm just thinking whether a year down the line, 18 months down the line, 2 years down the line, whenever that might be, whether when the prices increase pretty significantly, whether we'll start to be watching the outflows rather than the inflows of Bitcoin, and whether that could accelerate the next potential bear market. So I think that's something to keep an eye on now. I don't think we're anywhere near that stage at the moment. There's nothing to worry about at the moment. But I think that is probably one of the cons of the Bitcoin ETF is later down the line, when the very smart money managers, they might be taking profit and rebalancing when the prices are much higher. Anyone have any more areas that they're concerned about, like over the next year or two? We're all very bullish on crypto, obviously, but I think it's very important for the listeners to understand potentially some of the other risks that could play out, and why potentially it might not go exactly the way people are expecting. Does anybody else have any kind of negative factors, any risk factors that might be on the horizon?
Yeah, I can speak into this a little bit. So one of the things I've been trying to warn retail investors about for probably since I got into the crypto space, and that is through projects that maybe shouldn't be as big as they currently are. So I think as we're also missing out on, say, the explosive growth that your big players like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, etc. have normally had, where you're looking at like between 50 and 100x in a cycle, that's not really feasible in today's times, especially with the growing market cap of each of these projects. So I think as a result of that, retailers start looking towards more of your volatile altcoin to get rich quick and make a ridiculous amount of profit.
Yeah.
And that's when they need to be even more careful, because especially when you do have some of the big players and the more sophisticated projects that look to solve certain needs within the market, then you might have smaller projects that don't have that kind of backing and aren't likely to reach those levels, try piggyback off of that success while advertising the fact that they can still 100 to 200 to 300x. So I don't know if that's too bearish per se, but it is just a cause of concern. And at some point, all the bad projects do need to be shaken out. And in the past 5 or so years, that hasn't happened, and it still does need to take place at some point.
Yeah, I think just to your point, Claude, when you look at all the different projects that are getting funded at the moment, everything seems to be covered. There's not a requirement for a blockchain or a project to solve everything. So to your point, I really think that what it comes down to is the fundamentals of what the use case is of the project. We see really good projects that have a really solid backing team. They've got good investment. They've got a good narrative. But again, it's quite difficult to challenge then to the investor which ones of those are credible, and then of that group who really are going to be successful in the future, who's going to be around in 5 or 10 years. So that's something that I'm cautious as well on.
You've got to look at the risk as well. So obviously the new coins that are fresh for this upcoming bull market, they're going to be a lot more speculative in nature. The layer ones are going to have less developers and less network effects. Unlike companies in the traditional stock market, these are networks, and networks feed off having more developers, more people using the networks. And I think people need to know that just like startups and just like VC plays, there's obviously a high risk in some of these newer projects, but obviously with that higher risk comes a more potential gain. I think if we look at older projects that were in the last bull cycle, in the last 2 bull cycles, it's important to focus on the projects that were building very heavily during the bear market, that were actively updating, releasing new news, releasing new use cases, because I think there are quite a lot of projects which I like to call ghost chains, which haven't really been doing anything for the last number of years, but have some market name recognition. It's quite important to be able to differentiate that. Cool. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about for this upcoming bull cycle, a little bit more deeper in terms of narratives and things that you're excited about. And when we say narratives in crypto, I think narratives can sometimes come across as just an idea that gets a lot of hype behind it and then obviously drives price appreciation. But I want to dig into the weeds a little bit more and look at the different narratives and what type of projects that you think might be big in 2024, 2025, and give some of the reasons why you're bullish on those narratives. I'll start with you, Mark, this time. Is there any narratives that you're particularly excited about over the coming year?
Yeah. So for me, my main narratives surround layer 2 and gaming. Reasons being, I think from a layer 2 perspective, there is still that need to be able to scale layer 1 and improve efficiency. So when we look at how we get to quicker transactions, cheaper gas fees, I think there's a need for this when we look to how we, first of all, increase the sophistication of the layer 1s. I think these particular projects are essential. It's essentially how different projects are going to get the users, the scalability, and also having the security to be able to scale up. When we look at gaming, then say, for instance, there's the narratives that I'm looking at, and I've got some projects in mind, are the layer 2s that focus on gaming. So Immutable X is one of them. I think it's a really interesting project in terms of their development team, what they're doing in terms of how they can scale NFTs on the Ethereum blockchain. While NFTs is obviously was a hype topic, I think it's an important one for the gaming infrastructure. So in gaming, the way I'm looking at it as well is that we're always increasing the number of mobile users for gaming, and that doesn't seem to be going away. The amount of transactions in games is always increasing. So like when I look at that narrative, increasing users, increasing monetization, the requirements to be able to scale that technology, that's where for me, layer 2s in gaming is a hot crossover narrative that I'm focused on at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I'm going to ask you a few questions on a couple of those points. I'm also very bullish on GameFi and also layer 2s as well. I wanted to talk to you about the layer 2 approach. And Ethereum, obviously very difficult to scale, transaction fees are very high, etc. I wanted to talk to you more about layer 2s on top of Ethereum compared with other projects. Let's just say, for example, like Solana, who could potentially do it all on the base chain because of the higher transactions per second. Do you see that as a factor? When we're looking at layer 2s, are we really betting on the future of Ethereum being the dominant layer 1?
Not per se, Stephen. So like when I'm looking at other interesting layer ones that have come out after Ethereum, so Ethereum is obviously the incumbent or the standard. When we look at what can scale on Solana, what can scale on the BTC Lightning Network or Avalanche, say for instance, Avalanche is another layer one that I'm bullish on. I think where layer two comes in my opinion, is how to get the best out of the layer one ecosystems. And I think the best projects from the layer twos is going to be the ones who can, first of all, work with different ecosystems, but be able to scale and build really safely, efficiently, and be able to scale up with the demand that could potentially come about in the coming months. Again, it depends on the industries that or the sub narratives that are going to benefit from those layer twos. So in my opinion, gaming is going to be one of those. So that's where I see it. The narrative's not pinning itself on just the development and progress of Ethereum. From my perspective and from a risk perspective, I want to look at some of the older layer ones, but also some of the new innovative layer ones that have come out in the last few months or that are currently in like pre-development. That's the interesting areas for me. So yeah, for me, it's more just spreading my risk as best possible rather than picking projects right now, because I just think projects are still a bit risky for my appetite.
Yeah. All right. That's a good point. And the other thing on gaming as well is, obviously, I'm very bullish on gaming, but one of the things I find very difficult, so I'm very confident that GameFi is going to be a huge narrative for this upcoming bull cycle. But the issue is with gaming and GameFi is it's very difficult to pick which game is going to be very popular and which is going to become a AAA game or however they call it. So it is very difficult in terms of being able to select which project is going to come out as the eventual winner. I tend to try and take the more studio approach where they have multiple games. You obviously anticipate that one of those might be successful, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I think GameFi is going to be very popular, but I think it's going to be quite difficult to prove which one's going to be the winner.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And from my perspective, like I just call it one of the positions I'm bullish on. My position is to ensure that I have a good coverage of where the potential big games, to your point, could be. So that's where I'm at the moment. I'm still not like fully bullish on some of the games that are on some of the sub projects that I'm going to back, but that's like where I'm at the moment. I want to see how this narrative plays out, and we see how we go from there.
Yeah, and I think a rising tide helps all boats, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah. All right, Nick, which narratives are you excited about for the coming year or two?
I think that Ethereum will remain the dominant technology. That's the project I think that I'm most bullish on actually this year. Obviously, we had the transition from proof of work to the proof of stake, so that was a massive upgrade to the system. There's also another upgrade due to Ethereum later this year, which will help lower the transaction fees as well. It's still far and away, comfortably the second largest market cap of all the coins out there. It's less than, about 300 billion in round numbers versus Bitcoin, which is around 800 billion. So in terms of the price action as well, it's going to be easier to move Ethereum's price because of the smaller market cap as we see the traditional money cycle flow. But the ecosystem is healthy. There's lots of developers. It's thriving. And I think as blockchain technology is adopted in use cases in business and in people's social lives, Ethereum will remain that dominant project, I think, that will thrive.
Okay. And is your view of Ethereum, because it's the most kind of established layer one and it has the most developers, do you think it's got to the point now where the network effects have multiplied as much and that they're so far away from the rest of the layer one competitors that it's likely to accelerate in the future?
Yeah, I think it's also the trusted blockchain as well. What are there? Over 20,000 different coins and tokens. and Ethereum has been around a long time now. So I think it's the platform that people are developing on. The network effect is taking place, and I think it will benefit from the network effect greatly over the coming 12 months as well. And we're such a healthy community and a committed community as well. Really strong developers to improve Ethereum. I think, it will continue to remain the main chain that's being built on over the next few years.
Yeah. And it's very slowly deflationary now. It's gone over to proof of stake, right?
Correct.
Processes. Do you think that there's a large chance that the Ethereum ETF gets approved?
Yeah, I think we'll see it this year. I think we'll definitely see an ETH ETF approval this year. There's already a futures that's approved, so it's following the same path of Bitcoin as well. You're already getting the likes of Larry Fink talking about the Ethereum ETF. So obviously with the influence that he has in the markets, I think you have to listen to him. And I think we'll definitely see that approval at some point this year. And we'll see that a similar Ethereum run up like we did with Bitcoin as well last year.
Yeah, I think it has a good chance of approval as well, because it's a very similar process to Bitcoin. I guess they're quite lucky that the futures have already been approved, because they can use a similar court argument that you can't be treated any differently to the futures products that they've already approved. Poor Gary will have his arm twisted behind his back again. Poor Gary, eh? Excellent. All right. Thanks, Nick. Over to you, Claude. I think you mentioned a little bit at the start of the call, but maybe you can go into a bit more detail on the narratives that you're excited about.
Sure. Obviously, I fully agree with Nick in terms of Ethereum. I think that's going to be the obvious one for 2024. Going back to what I mentioned towards the start was around the decentralized physical infrastructure. I think there's a lot of interesting projects that are popping up all over there. I would encourage everybody to do a bit more research into that. I could probably speak about 2 hours just on everything that makes up all the different types of physical infrastructure networks. But I think Helium's looking quite interesting right now, especially with their pivot to their 5G services. Storage tokens such as Filecoin, also very interesting. So I would encourage any listeners to go check out all the progress happening there at the moment. But I have to also give a special mention to Basic Attention Token, as it's one of those projects that I've been bullish on for so many years now, and it just seems every bull cycle doesn't move in the way that I would expect. So that's one that's in my pocket as something that I see potentially being what makes me different from in terms of the strategy on eToro, because fortunately it is listed there. So very bullish on BAT in the long term.
Okay. Is it because it's listed on eToro, or are you more bullish on BAT than you would be on Filecoin, or Arweave is another big project as well in the file sharing sector?
Yeah, Basic Attention Token, not really part of the infrastructure networks. It's more just a side project outside of that I'm very bullish on, mainly because the Brave browser has been obviously growing considerably every single year in terms of users, and it gives users the power back in terms of advertising, which obviously advertising is such a massive sector, and I'm not really seeing any other projects tap into that industry the way that the Brave Foundation does with their BAT token.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much, Claude. I think that kind of wraps up a lot of the different narratives that we're excited about for the coming 12 to 18 months. We've already gone over a little bit, but I wanted to really ask the panel now, one by one. Obviously, there's a lot of projects that you're going to be bullish on. You're going to have a lot of different ones in your portfolio. But if I asked you to pinpoint one project that you're particularly excited about and that you think might drive either the most returns, or you think might be a really strong project over the next year or two, and the reasons why, that would be really great. And I think it would be really good for the audience to hear those. Mark, can I start with you?
Sure. Yeah. So I've already mentioned one, but I'll mention another that's really exciting for me. So it's Celestia.
Yeah.
So Celestia for me, modular blockchain. I think the way I'm picturing in my mind is difference to the normal blockchain. the monolithic blockchains have. Say, for instance, this allows more projects to be built across gaming. There's my plug again in gaming, but looking at mainly infrastructure, virtual machines, roll-ups, cross chains, DeFi. It's built to be able to facilitate these and facilitate them from the project's perspective, so they can build them upon Celestia. For me, I think it's still really early, and I think by using Celestia at the moment off eToro, there's lots of opportunities to get airdrops. There's lots of opportunities for swaps and for building liquidity. So for me, it's if there's a little bit of exposure there, for a few free airdrops, there's most of it is upside, to be honest. So aside from that part, I just find it's a really interesting concept. I use it in my mind. The example I think of is when I think of like public cloud versus private cloud when we look at VMs. So we're looking at private cloud. So it's been able to customize your blockchain to the needs of your project or your tech. Yeah. So that's one that I'm really bullish on as well. Celestia, TIA is the ticker.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. And if anyone from eToro is listening, someone please list Celestia for Mark so he can invest in it. Over to you, Nick. Which project are you most excited about?
Aside from Bitcoin, of course, it will be Ethereum. I've got the highest degree of conviction that Ethereum is here for the long term. The way I approach the crypto space, my allocation, just to give you an idea in terms of my investment, I'm 70% Bitcoin, 25% Ethereum, and there's a basket of altcoins of around funds. I do not spend a lot of time researching and looking into all these altcoins and projects. I think it's a lottery. I think it's extremely high risk. So my main focus is Bitcoin and Ethereum. So that's where I spend my time researching. That's what I'm most convicted with. And yeah, I just think you've got to be, I think, extremely invested into the crypto space to try and pick an altcoin that's going to run. So I adopt a landmine strategy with some altcoins. I've got a basket of coins that I think are going to do well. And if you 10x, 15x on one or two of these, great. But I just focus on Bitcoin and Ethereum.
Yeah, I think that's quite wise. And it sounds like you have a good risk-adjusted weightage for your cryptos in your portfolio. I think it's quite cool to do that with a small basket of altcoins as well, because what they essentially become is venture capital plays, right? So if you're invested in lots of different altcoins that have a higher risk, obviously a lot of them could go to zero and they might not be taken up, etc. And they might be seen as bad investments, but it would only take maybe 2 or 3 of those to pump in order to be able to significantly increase your portfolio and pay for some of those losers. Okay. All right. Claude?
Yeah, outside of the ones I've already mentioned, I'd probably say Polkadot's one of my big narratives for 2024. I just think with ever evolving projects that we're seeing, with the new tokens that are being introduced, the new sectors that are growing, the need for interoperability is it's higher than ever to allow these blockchains to actually communicate with each other and scale when it comes to building on the various chains. And I think that's where Polkadot's parachains actually allow for this to actually take place. So that's probably one of mine, especially with its current price points.
Yeah, I'm also very bullish on Polkadot in terms of the kind of technology and the parachains. I have noticed, though, since last year, it has been a little bit quiet in terms of the kind of marketing and hype around Polkadot. It has seemed to have dropped off a little bit, but I think they have been working pretty hard in the background during the bear market. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I do agree. Obviously, there is some competition in the industry. Also, if you look at Cosmos looking to solve a similar problem, but it is so strong in terms of the business model and how they continue to develop and introduce new technologies. While it might not be as flashy as maybe some of the other tokens, I definitely think it's a strong contender. But I'd also be interested, Stephen, what would you say is your big 2024 crypto play?
Okay, actually, my big 2024 crypto play is Sui. So is also not listed on eToro yet, but it's actually a project that's come out of the Facebook Libra project. A lot of the engineers, obviously that didn't come to fruition because of a lot of things come from the government and the pressure, which forced Meta to have to drop that project. But they had a lot of very talented engineers who were working on lots of different stuff. So what Sui's done is they've managed to have parallel block transactions, and they are operating on a new programming language called Move. And there's lots of developer action at the moment as well. And there's lots of projects being built on Sui as we speak in gaming and DeFi. It's still very early, but what I see is a lot of similarities to what was originally happening when Solana was launched. So I was a very early investor in Solana when it first launched on exchanges. So I wasn't a private investor, but as soon as it launched on exchanges, I was invested in Solana. And I see a lot of similarities between the early days of Solana and Sui. So I'm really big on the future of Sui. And on Twitter, I actually made 20 bold predictions, knowing that a lot of them will be wrong because none of us can see the future. But one of those predictions was I thought Sui was going to be out of the top 100 in the coin market cap, that Sui could potentially be in the top 3 gainers that are currently in the top 100 market cap on CoinCap. So we'll see if that comes to fruition. But I guess that's the project that I'm most excited about. I'm excited in lots of other projects as well, but I'm just hoping that eToro lists it before it gets too big and a lot of the gains are already gone.
They're really heavily invested in as well. They're really heavily backed. I'm just looking them up here. $300 million of Series B funding, like last year. That's
Mr. Labs is the company that launched the project. It is very similar to Aptos. So they both came out of the Facebook project, different engineers, and they're both using this Move programming language, which was originally set up for Meta. However, a lot of the developers and a lot of blog posts that I read and talking to a lot of different people in the industry, people are more bullish on Sui than generally on Aptos. The developers say it's a bit easier to develop on, the network effects are slightly higher. So we'll see how it plays out. It's very early stage of the project, but I think there's potentially good gains to be made. All right, so I think that's the end of this really great forum. I'm really glad that I got all of the input from our experts, crypto people on this forum. And I think it's really good every now and then for these quarterly forums to have a very specific subject so we can really dig into the weeds and let the listeners hear a lot more detail about projects or specific sectors. So thanks everybody for joining, and I look forward to speaking to you again on a future episode where we can come back and see whether the things that we said actually came to fruition during the bull market.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having us, Stephen. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.